So, not too long ago, the trailer for the next James Bond game was actually just revealed at PlayStation State of Play. As of today, it's actually been almost 13 years since the last James Bond game, which is honestly pretty crazy to think about. James Bond as a franchise has been around for over 60 years now, which is honestly pretty wild. There's been novels, films, toys, and plenty of video games for the famous British spy. And in fact, GoldenEye 007 on the N64 is the most critically acclaimed licensed game of all time. So a lot of people are naturally interested to see where this new James Bond game will go. But unfortunately, a pretty notorious subset of James Bond quote-unquote fans have risen from the grave to come complain about this trailer. I'm talking about none other than the anti-woke crowd who, for some reason, seem upset about James Bond of all things calling it woke now. Specifically, they seem upset that James Bond is now ugly in their opinion for some reason, and they also don't like that he has a diverse cast helping him out now. Oh boy. But, believe it or not, this doesn't necessarily just stop with this video game. James Bond has actually been criticized before for being quote-unquote woke by these exact people, believe it or not. Somehow this isn't even a new thing, so I wasn't even surprised when I saw them complaining about this. So today, I want to talk about all the anti-woke criticism that has actually been lobbed at James Bond in the past, why it's wrong, why it's not real criticism, and what real criticism of James Bond as an IP should really look like. To start, let's look at some of the videos that people have made about the new James Bond game, calling it woke. One such video comes from a channel called Tactical Templar, who talks about a lot of anti-woke stuff in content creation and gaming overall. Oh boy. He put out a video called "The New James Bond Game Looks Insanely Woke," so let's see what he had to say.
The name's woke. James Woke.
I'm just gonna let that intro speak for itself.
Who is this? Before you know anything about what I'm about to say, if I showed you this picture, who would you say this is? What character would you say this is? Well, you're wrong. This is apparently the new M.
So, in all honesty, I kind of question whether Tactical Templar has either read the James Bond novels or watched the movies, since if he had, he would know that M is a title. M itself isn't a character, it's actually a codename given to the head of MI6 in the James Bond universe. That's generally why each incarnation of Bond in the films, whenever they are rebranded, will get a new version of M as well. And heck, sometimes they even end up with two different versions of M within the same continuity, such as in the Craig films. In those films, Judi Dench actually played M, and then when she died, Ralph Fiennes took over the mantle. M is not a character whatsoever, so there's no real identity tied to it. So him acting like it's a big surprise that this is the new M honestly isn't a surprise if you know the nature of the character, or really the title.
Let me repeat that because some of you may have just looked at me like I'm crazy. This is the new M. She's a Hindi.
Yes, I think people are gonna look at you like you're crazy, cause A, not only are you getting upset about something that is actually in nature with the James Bond universe, you also didn't use Hindi correctly there. Hindi is the language. This is an Indian woman. Maybe do some research on this stuff before you decide to complain about it on the internet.
Now again, you may be asking yourself, who are these two people? The character on the left, that is supposed to be James Bond. Who do you think the character on the right is? Who do you think that ugly looking freak on the right is? Was your answer Moneypenny?
I find it funny that he gets upset that this version of Moneypenny is played by a black woman now, because funny enough, the most recent version of Moneypenny in the films was a black woman. In the Daniel Craig James Bond films, Naomi Harris takes on the role of Miss Moneypenny, and the funny thing is, she's often considered one of the best versions of that character. Moneypenny as a character is often a secretary to M in the books and films, and often has romantic feelings for James Bond that she usually can't fully act on. They usually have a lot of very flirty scenes together in the films. Lois Maxwell, who played Moneypenny in the earliest Sean Connery films, does tend to be the fan favorite when it comes to variations on that character, but Naomi Harris really brought a very new energy to Moneypenny. Instead of simply just starting off as M's secretary, she actually ends up becoming that after getting traumatized in an incident where Bond is nearly killed. Before this, however, she's actually introduced as a field agent in Skyfall. I think this is actually pretty cool, and it does provide a bit more depth to her character and also let her be a bit more proactive than she would be as the secretary, although the Lois Maxwell Maxwell version of the character is obviously very great as well. But again, this shows that not only A, Moneypenny has been black before, but B, it's actually been received pretty well, so I'm not really sure what this guy is on about. Guess he forgot the Naomi Harris version exists, huh? What do you know?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's never just one thing with these woke games. It's never just one decision, one race swap, one thing. It is a mental illness. It is a problem with the thinking of the people behind the scenes, because their ideology is so so completely antithetical. They want to create a game that's going to have lasting power, and a game that is ultimately going to be able to capture the imaginations of the audience. So having an ugly, black, looking Moneypenny, already that in itself is the wrong thing to do. There is no reason that Bond should look that generic and that plain and that uninteresting, and why Moneypenny should be black, and why she should look like an absolute and why she should be this ugly.
Okay, honestly, this part especially confuses me. In one sentence here, he complains about how he thinks this version of Bond looks very plain and uninteresting, but just previously he was complaining about the changes made to the other characters. One of which, again, isn't even a new change. So he doesn't like how Bond looks here, which is honestly a pretty accurate portrayal of how he generally looks in most media, being a white, chiseled British man, so it's pretty par for the course. But he also doesn't like the change that M's job is now being filled by an Indian woman, which honestly isn't that big of a change anyway. It really just feels like he's saying, oh, how dare you keep Bond the same as he always is, but also how dare you change M's role. Doesn't really make much sense when you think about it. It's basically just him saying, oh, I do want change, but not that kind of change, which, alright then.
The whole point of Moneypenny is that she wasn't super attractive, like she wasn't like a supermodel, but she was good looking enough. Like, she could flirt with James Bond and you sort of believe it, like maybe they're gonna get together, kind of, but, you know, not really. But there's not a single person who would buy her as Moneypenny.
I mean, again, people already bought her as Moneypenny during the Craig trilogy. This literally has already happened. This guy is so focused on the fact that he thinks a black Moneypenny is terrible and spreading woke propaganda that he totally forgets there already was a black Moneypenny in the movies.
And this is the problem, is that if you're going to create something that's not new and work with something that already exists, you have got to put the audience as they are.
But that's the thing, this game actually is putting the IP as it is. Things like Q or M are just code names. They're not even tied to a specific identity or ethnicity. This is definitely shown in the books, but again, also in the movies, since there's been two M's in the Daniel Craig films. Judi Dench played the female M starting out, and also she played M during the Pierce Brosnan era, and then Ralph Fiennes came in to fill in her role in the Craig films after her character died. So, if anything, the James Bond series especially lends itself to this, since there have been so many different versions of all these characters throughout the series' 60-year history. James Bond, in a lot of ways, with how it's set up, allows it to be one of the most versatile media franchises out there. After this, though, he tries to show some old clips of Moneypenny to try and prove his point, which honestly just comes off as even worse.
You know, this sort of behavior could qualify as sexual harassment.
Like, look at this. Like, this is James Bond and Moneypenny. This is the dynamic. Like, what do you think the dynamic between this James Bond and this frumpy-looking freak is going to be? And this is my point. Why do these companies not oversee this in a more strict manner and put the kibosh on terrible ideas like this? Oh, I have an idea. We're going to make Moneypenny. We're going to make her Hindi. We're going to make her Indian, and we're going to have her be a woman. You know, because Dame Judi Dench was a woman. How about the fact that in the movies you had Ralph Fiennes BM after Judi Dench? He's a white man, which is what Q, you know, Q should be a white man. M should be a white. You're supposed to be portraying Britain or London.
I mean, both black people and Indian people can be British too, so I'm not really sure what he's going on about here.
And the fact is that you're surrounding him with a bunch of women, which, you know, usually for James Bond that makes sense, but they're all unattractive. It's so shockingly stupid and out of touch and delusional. And it's like these people make these decisions and then they wonder why they fail. What do you mean that our entire studio is being shut down? What do you mean that we're all being laid off and fired? The moment that you understand that aesthetics do matter, that race swapping characters doesn't work, that you may get support from a bunch of on Twitter, at the end of the day, it affects your bottom line.
No, it really doesn't affect their bottom line at all, because once again, and I know I keep bringing this up, but Black Moneypenny already appeared in Skyfall, which actually, to this day, is the highest grossing Bond film of all time. It in fact is one of the highest grossing films of all time, period, having made over $1 billion. It is just utterly mind-blowing to me that this guy would try to spread misinformation when it's so clearly there. Like, anyone who's seen the Bond films, specifically the most recent ones, knows this isn't true. This is utterly mind-blowing. No matter whether it's a film or a game you're talking about, introducing a diverse cast is not the thing that's gonna make it a failure. Skyfall being a great example. It introduced a really well-written new take on Moneypenny that just also happened to be black. Something like The Acolyte had a black main character and it happened to be a huge failure, but it wasn't because it had a black character in it. That show was bad because of all the plot holes in it, a lot of inconsistent character motivations, and really rushed pacing and storytelling, not bothering to give its characters any time to develop at all. There are so many other things behind the scenes with any kind of media that you should really be criticizing it for. You can't just look at a game or film, see a person of color, and call it woke. That's not real criticism. It always comes down to the writing, the pacing, the character development, all the things you should really criticize a story for and look at thoroughly. But unfortunately, it looks like this guy missed that. But interestingly enough, this isn't even the first time the James Bond franchise has been called woke, believe it or not. In 2021, Daniel Craig starred in his final Bond film, that being No Time to Die. And what do you know? This film, of all films, was actually called woke by a lot of people. For some reason, despite the anti-woke grifters not really complaining about all the other Bond films that feature a female version of M and also a black version of Moneypenny, they decided to hone in on this one specifically, the final Daniel Craig film, and there is a reason for that, so let's get into it. Inevitably, a lot of the anti-woke grifters made videos on this film when it initially came out, and what do you know, none other than the poster child for anti-woke film criticism, the Critical Drinker, just so happened to make one. Let's take a look at his video and see what he had to say on this.
What we really need from Bond is for him to be old and retired, slowing down physically, carefully controlled and toned down so that he's as respectful, non-threatening and uncontroversial as possible, so that he can ultimately be replaced by someone more suitable and diverse.
Okay, so right off the bat, this isn't even true because in the film, Nomi doesn't actually replace James Bond as 007. She simply holds the 007 designation while James Bond is retired, and then when he comes back and is reinstated, he gets that designation back. That happens at like the midpoint of the film. This is just straight up spreading misinformation. Gee, I wonder if Drinker even watched No Time to Die, huh?
So I was particularly excited by the recent news coming out about Bond 25, where we learned the character would be changed to reflect the fallout from the Me Too movement.
Okay, so nowhere in the marketing for this film did the filmmakers ever describe this as James Bond for the Me Too movement. Obviously, Drinker is just making this up. But I think this claim actually opens up a greater discussion in general. Obviously, since the very beginning, in a lot of ways, James Bond has been all about objectifying women. Of course, this is very much something that wouldn't fly today at all, but it was the 60s and it was a very different time. However, I find it very interesting that Drinker tries to say that No Time to Die is Bond for the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement officially started in 2017 as a result of the pretty infamous accusations against disgraced media mogul Harvey Weinstein. Before this, what was supposed to be the final James Bond film starring Daniel Craig, Spectre, had come out in 2015. So because of the 2-year gap between Spectre and the Me Too movement starting up and No Time to Die entering production not long afterward, Drinker seems to theorize that No Time to Die must have been made as Bond for the Me Too movement, clearly, because there's no misogynistic elements that were there previously. But this just isn't true, because if you look at a lot of the other Daniel Craig James Bond films, you can actually see a lot of misogynistic elements from him that are there in previous films being removed from him in these films. A great example is in Casino Royale. When Vesper dies, he actually shows emotion for her death. If this had been any other James Bond film, he probably would have just moved on and not really cared about her death. But Daniel Craig's version of James Bond is meant to be more introspective and emotional and break down the form of toxic masculinity that James Bond is meant to represent over the years. Another very similar thing happens in Skyfall, where James Bond actually cries when his mother figure M ends up dying. Again, if this had been any other James Bond film, this wouldn't have happened. He would have just moved on and not really cared. But Daniel Craig's portrayal of Bond is meant to be a more realistic portrayal of a man in the 21st century with lots of emotion and scars that he can't really hide from. This is what makes his take on the character a lot more compelling than much of the other portrayals of Bond over the years. So really, the deconstruction of Bond as an icon of toxic masculinity had already started before No Time to Die came out anyway. No Time to Die supposedly being Bond for the Me Too movement just isn't true. But believe it or not, Critical Drinker wasn't the only one to get upset at No Time to Die. Oh no! None other than his loyal manservant Nerdrotic decided to get mad at the film as well around its release. I've talked about both Critical Drinker and Nerdrotic on this channel before, and in a lot of ways, I honestly consider Nerdrotic even worse than Critical Drinker. He's a lot more blatant about creating rage bait than Drinker. He's honestly just a lot more blatantly racist too, and ultimately he's not a real critic, much like Critical Drinker isn't either. So I guess let's see what he had to say about No Time to Die.
Many have speculated, including yours truly, that James Bond's No Time to Die, which I lovingly call No Time to Me Too, is just going to be a deconstruction of yet another traditional male character.
Again, this really isn't anything new for Bond at all, like I already discussed. Daniel Craig's films were already breaking down the character even before No Time to Die. This isn't anything new to No Time to Die at all.
And I'm going to give you a fourth headline just because it gets straight to the point. From Bleeding Fool, No Time to Die director says James Bond was a drapist. Brilliant way to sell your film that needs to make $900 million.
Actually, yeah, it is, because he's talking about how this version of Bond isn't a rapist. Notice he was showing the older version of Bond there in that picture. Especially in the wake of a lot more sexual harassment being brought to light these days, this honestly is a good selling point for this film. And again, it isn't even anything new for Bond. This already started with Casino Royale even. And that was back in 2006, which is almost 20 years ago now. Jesus, I'm old.
The director of the upcoming James Bond film No Time to Die, Cary Fukunaga, recently admitted the movie is woke while trying to deny rumors that writer Phoebe Waller-Bridge was brought in to wokeify the film. Now, when John F. Trent here, the man who wrote the article, says things like wokeify or woke, it's meant in a general term. What he's really trying to say is we will be getting an intersectional feminist James Bond film.
Not really, because once again, the character they keep trying to argue is an intersectional feminist, that being Nomi, doesn't even replace James Bond in this movie. He literally still has the 007 designation by the end of the film.
Fukunaga discusses how he is modernizing James Bond for a post-#MeToo reality, according to The Hollywood Reporter's Tatiana Siegel. First, the director accuses James Bond of drape, and yes, I have to use YouTube language here, in past films. He states, is it Thunderball or is it Goldfinger, where like basically Sean Connery's character drapes a woman? And he adds, she's like, no, no, no. And he's like, yes, yes, yes. That wouldn't fly today.
So the thing is, in Goldfinger, James Bond actually does sexually assault a woman. This is actually something that happens in the film between James Bond and Pussy Galore when they're in a bar together and he literally pins her down and molests her. Fun fact, this is actually even worse than the book version of Goldfinger, where Pussy Galore is actually a lesbian. And when this scene occurs in the book, he actually ends up sexually assaulting the lesbian out of her, which is a big yikes. So this article isn't really wrong at all, because this is something that did happen a lot in the Bond films early on, especially Goldfinger, so it really wouldn't fly today at all.
They have modernized James Bond since then. That film was made in the 60s, and it was of its time, and no one is asking for that.
Okay, so you just read this article and made it seem like they were being whiny when complaining about a lot of the rapey scenes in the early Bond films, but then you also just go ahead and say that nobody wants to see that. Nerdrotic straight up admits that here and defeats his own point. He'll complain that these filmmakers are pushing a woke agenda by getting rid of Bond's more misogynistic traits, but then also in the same sentence admit that wouldn't fly today and that nobody wants to see that. He literally wants to have his cake and eat it too. It makes zero sense. And again, ultimately, this just isn't real criticism. If you really want to criticize No Time to Die, there's a lot of other things to look at rather than just the fact that Bond is no longer misogynist and there just so happens to be a black woman in the film too. Heck, you know what? I'll do it right now. I think No Time to Die is a pretty solid movie, but it definitely does have some noticeable flaws. I think it does have a lot of strengths for sure, like the really heartfelt emotional standoff it gives James Bond and the realization that he's now a father and he'll never get to see his wife and children ever again. but I think there's a lot of jumbled plot elements that feel like they were rather rushed overall in this film. One would definitely be Blofeld's inclusion in this film, since I honestly find him kind of pointless here, and he just feels like he was very tacked on in order to carry over plot points from Spectre. And honestly, I don't like Blofeld in Spectre either, and I find him super pointless there too, and probably a textbook example of how not to bring back a legacy villain. Sort of like how they brought back Khan in Star Trek Into Darkness. So that honestly could be a whole video in of itself talking about how not to bring back legacy villains, so let me know down below if that's a video you'd like to see here on the channel at some point. But regardless, Blofeld doesn't really make much sense to be here, especially since the main villain in No Time to Die is actually Safin. And honestly, Safin I never really found that interesting of a villain overall, since he just feels like a retread of better villains even in the Daniel Craig films like Silva from Skyfall. In a lot of ways, I would actually say a lot of elements of No Time to Die just feel like a retread of previous Daniel Craig films overall, and just kind of lesser and not really with the same gusto that those had. But I do think the good aspects of No Time to Die are definitely very strong, such as the aforementioned really emotional death scene and also his relationship with Madeline overall throughout the film. And really just the deconstruction of Bond as a character overall and showing him not even wanting to be an MI6 agent anymore. That right there would be an actually critical way to criticize No Time to Die, but unfortunately these guys can't do that. Instead, they just want to call this film woke. Also, it should be noted that if you'd like to see my more in-depth reviews on James Bond films overall, you can check out my Letterboxd since I've been writing up a review for each film over there. That's down in the link in the description. But inevitably, both Critical Drinker and Erotic aren't actually criticizing No Time to Die and just spreading misinformation about a black woman replacing James Bond, which if you've seen the film, you know that's not even true. I also find it interesting that most of the anti-woke videos on No Time to Die actually came out before the film even released in theaters. And the majority of them you can see mostly base their information off of either things that are said in articles or interviews with the filmmakers or just off of the trailer. Since obviously when this film was coming out, there was a lot of skepticism on its quality since it had been in development for a long time and a lot of delays due to the pandemic were making people rather nervous about it. And of course, that made it very easy for a lot of these anti-woke grifter channels to expound upon this nervousness and skepticism leading up to the film and try to claim it was gonna be woke in order to spread their own agenda. Because, believe it or not, as much as the grifters want to complain about a woke agenda in every movie, they have their own agenda, believe it or not. They don't even try to hide that. It happened back in 2021 with No Time to Die, and history is really just repeating itself with this new James Bond game that is coming out. I think perhaps one of the most absurd criticisms I've seen from the anti-woke crowd for the new James Bond game is the fact that they think he looks like Nathan Drake. And they're also claiming that's a woke change as well, which I find really baffling. So James Bond being a white straight male as he's always been with no real change to his character whatsoever is now woke as well? Come on, make it make sense. In fact, going back to the game that sparked this whole video discussion to begin with, Tactical Templar isn't even the only anti-woke game critic that has tried to attack it. Inevitably, there's actually been quite a few since the trailer dropped. One such channel that has tried to talk about it is Dr. Disaster, who I've discussed before on this channel for his video on Onimusha 2. More specifically, how he didn't like that the remaster of Onimusha 2 had a grand total of 2 censored scenes. And this made him think it's because there are more jealous women working in the gaming industry. Oh boy. Yeah, clearly that's the reason for 2 censored scenes of scenes that are already censored anyway. So of course, he decided to go ahead and talk about James Bond First Light as well. Let's see what he had to say.
So, suffice to say that the idea of a new James Bond video game for the first time in a long-ass time, made by the developers of the Hitman series, seemed like the easiest slam dunk that I could think of, and I allowed myself to get really excited about it.
I made a huge tiny mistake.
I guess I shouldn't have allowed myself to hope too much though. An awesome James Bond origin story made by IO Interactive seemed too good to be true, but it turns out that they didn't have the balls to tailor it after the Ian Fleming novels and set it in the 60s where the story belongs.
The thing is though, pretty much every film adaptation of James Bond has actually been tailored after the era it premieres in. It actually isn't ever consistently set in the 1960s. For instance, all the Sean Connery films are actually set in the 50s and 60s, but all the Roger Moore films are set in the 1980s, and all the Pierce Brosnan films are set in the 90s and early 2000s, and all the Daniel Craig films are set in the modern era. So really, the majority of the Bond films actually haven't taken place in the 60s. There's no set in stone rule that says they should, as evidenced by all the other movies.
No, instead, they set it in current day, and they filled the cast of characters with current day people, so to speak.
What do you mean by current day people? Black people existed in the 1960s as well. Indian people did also. Not like black and Indian people just magically appeared in the year of our Lord 2025.
The bulk of the trailer features a conversation between the newest version of M, which is this character here, a Hindi-looking chick, because of course it is.
Again, Hindi isn't a race, it's a language. M is Indian here. I swear all these anti-woke grifters just play a giant game of telephone whenever they make these videos, since all of them have gotten the race wrong.
This was my first hint when watching the trailer that they weren't interested in following the original novels very closely at all. Anyhow, the trailer has M arguing with this dude here, a guy called Greenway, played by the guy who plays Morgan from The Walking Dead. These appear to be the two primary authority figures that James Bond will be working under for this story, and this is just pure pandering all the way. They can't let ethnically British people play the roles of any character besides James Bond himself, apparently, because they feel the need to flirt with the modern audience.
Okay, again, Indian people and black people can still be British, and in this trailer, they are shown to be. So whether Dr. Disaster wants to admit it or not, M, Greenway, and Moneypenny are all still British in this trailer.
And I'm not a fan of that. And I'm not a fan of Moneypenny once again being a black gal. They did it in the Daniel Craig movies, which, to be crystal clear, I am not a fan of the Daniel Craig James Bond movies at all. Bond has been on life support since Craig took over, going on 20 years ago.
Kinda interesting he says that when actually some of the highest grossing Bond films of all time were made under Daniel Craig. Like I said before, the highest grossing James Bond film of all time is Skyfall, which is a Daniel Craig movie that made over $1 billion. And a lot of the other Daniel Craig films made pretty close to $1 billion too, with Spectre making over $800 million and No Time to Die making over $700 million. So no, the franchise has not been on life support since Daniel Craig entered the fray at all. If anything, he revitalized it.
Moneypenny is a black gal again, and she first shows up in the game by taking away, by stealing, Bond's signature catchphrase. The clip I'm about to show you makes my eyes roll and my skin crawl. Just listen to this crap.
Do you have an appointment?
The name's Bond.
James Bond. He's with me.
Let the dude say his catchphrase, for the love of all things holy. If they can't let him do this, then it makes me suspect that Bond won't be sleeping around and killing bad guys with a suave and dispassionate disposition. In other words, that clip makes me suspect that they are once again trying to reinvent the character for a modern audience, making it more appealing to the female and non-binary crowd out there.
My guy, you're complaining about a joke clip from this trailer of Moneypenny just so happens to finish Bond's catchphrase for him. Really? And of course, Dr. Disaster extrapolates this by saying this one clip of Moneypenny finishing James Bond's catchphrase means this will be a woke disaster. And clearly this game is only meant to appeal to women and non-binary folk. Yeah, sure, whatever you say, buddy.
AKA the people who generally don't give a shit about this IP any more than I care about a franchise that was originally made for them, like The Sims.
Wait, what? How is The Sims only targeting women and non-binary folk? The original Sims game was pretty much enjoyed by everybody when it came out, and it's actually one of the best-selling games of all time, having sold over 41 million copies. And the franchise overall is one of the best-selling game series of all time, having sold over 200 million copies. But don't worry guys, clearly it's only targeting women and non-binary folk, otherwise it wouldn't have sold so much.
And One other thing I don't particularly care for with this game, thus far anyway, from what I'm seeing of it, is the fact that in this game, James Bond looks young as hell. The 90s James Bond Jr. cartoon was a pretty massive flop. Nobody wanted to watch that garbage, so I'm not sure what they're doing here.
I mean, he doesn't look overly young, he's not like a teenager or anything. He looks like he's in his late 20s or early 30s, which in all honesty is probably the prime age to be a super spy duking it out in various situations, and also pulling off a lot of crazy stunts. What exactly was the age range you were looking for?
I believe they will deliver a fun game, and for anyone willing to overlook the cringy pandering to the identity politics crowd, this is likely to have some enjoyable gameplay.
Oh right, because M's role now being filled by a British woman who is still Indian by the way, is clearly pandering. Even though, again, as stated before, M is a title, not a character, so by default, anyone can fill that role. And also again, we've already had a Black Moneypenny before who was received very well, so what's your point here? I honestly find it even more baffling that he admits that the game will still probably be a good time and that he's still gonna get it. Dr. Disaster just spent 8 minutes complaining about this game only to say he's gonna buy it still at the end here. And the reason he gives is because he thinks it looks like a genuinely fun game, which, yeah, I think that's why a lot of people are excited for this game. It does look genuinely good, and the Hitman developers that are making it honestly have a very good track record. And it's also been over 10 years since there's been a James Bond video game, so I think a lot of fans are looking forward to this one. So really, he kinda disproves his own point, since the introduction of diverse characters doesn't ruin a game at all. Huh, what do you know, what a shock. Overall, the anti-woke criticism for both No Time to Die and this new James Bond game are honestly equally foolish. James Bond having a black version of Moneypenny isn't even anything new, as much as these guys would like to try to convince you that it is. James Bond also was never replaced by a black woman, as much as they'd like to convince you of that as well. All that's really happened with James Bond in the last 20 years is a more thoughtful approach of the character and also making him more developed. As I stated before, the version of Bond shown in Casino Royale, Skyfall, and all those other movies is honestly a lot more interesting since he shows so much more emotion and vulnerability. It makes him feel much more fleshed out and developed, unlike a lot of the other previous versions of Bond, as fun as they might have been. The way Daniel Craig chose to approach the character honestly had a lot more nuance, and it just came off with more depth in general. It felt more like he had repressed emotions that he didn't want any others to see, rather than no emotions at all, and that's honestly just a lot more interesting and well written. There's ultimately a lot more to that than just a guy who's soulless and goes around banging women and beating people up. So really, as much as a film audience has evolved, so has the character of James Bond. That's really all there is to it. No woke agenda, as much as these guys would like to try to say there is. Personally, I'm very excited for the upcoming James Bond game, and assuming I'm streaming on Twitch again at that point, since I haven't streamed on Twitch in a long time now, I might stream it on there for sure. Let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see Twitch streams in the future, regardless of whether it's James Bond or not. But overall, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it or learned something from it. What do you think? Are you excited for the new James Bond game? Let me know down in the comments below. If you think there's a topic I should cover here on YouTube, be sure to join my Discord, since we have a suggestions and questions channel where you can suggest topics for me to cover here on YouTube. You can also check out my letterbox, as stated before, to see reviews of movies and shows, oftentimes movies and shows I won't cover here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, all the things down there. Special thanks to my patrons DGC1996 and Trayvon Gibson for supporting me over there. Also thanks to You the Guardian, David Deister, Jared the Rabbit, and Balf Games for becoming YouTube members. I appreciate all your support in general, it really helps me keep doing what I do here. Also consider subscribing, since I make a lot of videos on film and media overall, so if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like the others I have planned as well. But regardless, thank you so much for watching today's video, and I hope you really liked it. I've been Otterly Noah, and I'll see you on the Otter side. Bye!